Judge, I think I can rephrase the question so we can move on. If that's okay with the court.
Yes.
Mr. Feldman, I'd like to direct your attention to that point in time after you had resolved the case of Chandler versus Jackson, okay?
Yes.
Do you recall at any point having a discussion with representatives of any district attorney's office with regard to your client, Jordan Chandler, appearing before a grand jury?
Vaguely, yes. Vaguely, yes.
Do you recall the substance of that conversation?
Objection. Hearsay. Foundation. Relevance, and beyond the scope.
This is.
You may answer, yes, or, no.
I mean, I can't.
Yes, or, no.
You have to lean into the microphone.
Oh.
Do you want the question?
Well, yes, and no, Your Honor. I mean, I remember the substance.
Okay. To your knowledge, after the case of Chandler versus Jackson was resolved, did your client, Jordan Chandler, ever appear before a grand jury?
Objection. Leading. Beyond the scope.
Overruled. You may answer.
To my knowledge, he never appeared before a grand jury.
Now, you were asked just before Mr. Mesereau finished his examination, about a purported conversation between you and Mr. King and Mr. Viner, or Viner.
Viner.
Viner?
Viner is what he said.
Yes. And do you recall any such meeting?
I never met with Mr. Viner. I did once meet with Mr. King. I do remember meeting with Mr. King, but I can tell you there wasn't a meeting with Viner.
Were there other people present?
Well, we were in the delicatessen in Beverly Hills, so there were a lot of other people around.
Where were you having breakfast, lunch, dinner? You were in a deli, I assume you were eating.
I was having breakfast with a producer from their show,
Whose show?
Larry King's show, and he was sitting at a table, like over here, with.
Indicating to your right?
Right. With 6 of his pals that he had breakfast with.
And were you with somebody else?
Yes.
Who were you with?
I was with his producer.
Who is?
Whose name was, or is, Nancy Baker, I think her name was.
Is that the only time you ever recall being in any kind of close proximity with Mr. Viner?
Well, I'm not even sure he was one of these guys. I didn't have any discussion with any of those guys about anything, I can tell you. They were trying to get me to come on their show. That's all we ever possibly talked about, I knew Mr. King. I've run into him since at different events.
By Mr. King, you're talking about Larry King?
Right.
The guy's on.
We say hello to each other. We see each other, talk to each other, never having talked about this case, and they did want me to come on their program. I mean, I do remember them talking to me about that. But I can tell you that I didn't tell them, and I didn't tell anybody else, anything about what anybody tells me, because it is absolutely privileged, and it would be absolutely improper. And if anybody says that, that person is lying. Can't make it clearer than that.
Let me just ask you a couple other questions, or at least one other question about the Chandler versus Jackson lawsuit. You indicated in response to one of Mr. Mesereau's questions that the defendant in that case, which would have been Mr. Jackson, were the ones who wanted the parents to share in the financial or monetary settlement of the case.
That's right.
Now, that seems counterintuitive. Can you explain to us why that happened?
Objection. Relevance. Foundation. Move to strike.
Overruled.
The reason it happened was because Mr. Jackson's legal team wanted confidentiality. They didn't want anybody ever talking about this. And they were concerned if, in fact, the parents weren't getting money.
I'm going to object. This is non-responsive. And move to strike.
They said this, Your Honor.
And calls for speculation and its hearsay.
No, the question was, can you explain why that happened? And that's what he's explaining. So.
They told us that they wanted the parents to get the money so that the parents would be bound by the settlement agreement, so that the parents couldn't talk, that the parents couldn't write a book, the parents couldn't go. I mean, we weren't precluded from talking to the police. They weren't able to write a book. They weren't able to go on television. They weren't able to do anything. And they wanted the parents bound. And it's because of that I brought in a retired Court of Appeal judge to become the new guardian ad litem, because I didn't want the parents taking anything away from the child.
All right. Now, at the time that you were introduced to the Arvizos family, Did you or were you aware of the fact that Gavin Arvizos had had cancer?
Yes.
And were you given information about the severity of the cancer that he had?
Yes. Very severe. Life-threatening.
And did the advice that you gave to the Arvizos family during the time that you did represent them involve considerations about Gavin's health?
Objection. Leading. And beyond the scope and foundation.
Sustained.
Your Honor, could I?
It's beyond the scope.
Beyond the scope? Mr. Feldman, based upon, well, let me go back and lay one foundational thing. Did you, during the course, and I don't obviously want you to disclose anything that was said, but as a foundational matter, during the course of the time that you did represent the Arvizos family, and Gavin Arvizos in particular, did you have discussions with Gavin?
Yes.
Objection is beyond the scope.
Well, I.
Overruled. The answer is yes. Next question.
All right. Based upon your conversations with Gavin and those of the family, and your experience in civil suits as a trial lawyer, as an experienced litigator, are you able to tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury whether, in your opinion, Gavin Arvizos has any interest in pursuing a suit against Michael Jackson over these molestation charges?
Objection. Calls for speculation. Beyond the scope. Foundation.
Sustained.
Is that a foundational thing, Your Honor, or just in total?
All of them. No, that's not a proper question.
All right. Mr. Mesereau asked you a question as to, when he was asking you about criminal cases versus civil cases, and why in your opinion it would be foolish to go criminal first before you would go civil. Do you recall that?
He was saying it's easier to go criminal than go civil. That's what he was.
And you said it was foolish?
Oh, I said it's foolish?
Yeah, not him.
Oh, I said it's foolish. Yeah, well, if I said it or not, I think it is foolish.
All right, explain why.
Well, part of it is what he just said. As a lawyer, I want to control what happens. I want to protect this child. The only person that was ever going to be my client, even though they all signed a retainer, was this child, and Gavin, and I wanted to do what's best for Gavin. The district attorney represents the people. They have to prove it by beyond a reasonable doubt. As Mr. Mesereau says, in a civil case, you only have to prove it by a preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not. And so I would never, if I was going to do a civil case, ever want the district attorney, the police, any criminal case, involved with a civil case. In a civil case, in a criminal case defendants have Fifth Amendment rights, and they don't have to testify. In a civil case, things are different, and I would never want to do what Mr. Mesereau said. It is almost inhumane, when you have a cancer victim, to have him go through a criminal trial, and then maybe he gets convicted, and then all of a sudden, now he's going to do it again and spend these years of his life. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't be a part of doing it. And I don't know many lawyers in this, who practice good law would ever suggest that the district attorney start and handle the case. I didn't do it in 93. I wouldn't have done it in 2003. And I won't ever do it.
Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Feldman, do you know that Gavin is not only in remission, he's playing football?
I know he's in remission. But I know that stress can impact cancer.
But you knew he was in remission a long time ago?
I know, I didn't know where he was. He's better today than he was when I first met Gavin. Gavin's done wonderful physically over the last, how long has this been? Almost 2 years now. He's doing much better. If you saw him then compared to seeing him now.
Have you ever been a criminal prosecutor yourself?
A criminal prosecutor?
Yes.
No.
Are you aware that criminal prosecutors often look to see if civil lawyers are trying to use the criminal process to win their cases for them?
Say that one more time.
Are you aware that prosecutors often, when approached by civil lawyers, are wary to see if civil lawyers are trying to use them to win their cases for them in the criminal courts?
I wouldn't have any idea what they do.
You're not changing what you told the jury earlier, that if you have a judgment of a criminal conviction, you can go into civil court and use it to establish liability just with the document?
I'm not changing what I said. If you had a criminal, we're talking about, no, I wouldn't change that.
No further questions.
The deadly one more question.
Yeah, I've heard it.
You know, it's an occupational hazard.
Yes, I know.
Let's just get back to this thing that Mr. Mesereau was just talking about, the impact of a criminal conviction. For you, as a trial lawyer, could you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what the difference is between compensatory damages and punitive damages?
Yeah, in compensatory, you're trying to make a person whole. The jury assesses what is the losses. In the grown-up, it would be loss of income, medical bills, home care, things of that nature. And pain and suffering or emotional distress. That's what we call compensatory, and what the law says about that is the purpose is to make somebody whole. Punitive damages are something that is on top of that. It is to punish someone who needs to be punished for bad behavior. In certain places in the law, not in all cases. Most cases you can't get them, but in certain places under the law, sexual molestation would be one. Assault and battery would be another. Fraud, where somebody is guilty of what we call malice, or fraud, or oppression, is another. And in those, the law says you got a higher standard of care, still not as high as a criminal case, but you have to prove malice. And in order to prove malice, you have to prove fault. And it's a different fault than the fault that's in a criminal, because I don't know what exactly you have to prove in a criminal case, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. But it doesn't just follow that you wouldn't have to go back to starting to prove things all over again if you were to be in a civil case. And you can't tell. A lot of criminal cases wind up hung juries. I mean, it's just not the way most civil lawyers do things, and...
Thank you. No further questions.
To Mr. Mesereau, well, there goes that last question, huh? If you'd raise your hand, I'd stop.
Mr. Feldman, if you're going in front of a civil jury, and you're trying to prove that the civil defendant acted with malice.
Yes.
Don't you think it might affect that jury if the civil defendant is a convicted felon?
I think it helps. Yeah, sure.
Of course it helps, doesn't it?
Of course it helps. But that's, you got to balance this about a kid who's got cancer and who's sick and...
That's not what we're talking about, Mr. Feldman. I ask you, if you go into civil court and are trying to prove malice to get punitive damages, and the defendant is a convicted felon, you have a much easier road, don't you?
Yes.
Thank you.
I keep my word.
All right, thank you. You may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Call your next witness.
People call Jesus Salas.
He's on his way in.
Come to the front of the courtroom, please. When you get to the witness stand, please remain standing. Face the clerk and raise your right hand.
I do.
Please be seated. State and spell your name for the record.
My name is Jesus Salas. Jesus, Salas, Salas.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Salas.
Good afternoon.
In the year 2003, Mr. Salas, who were you employed by?
I was employed by Neverland Valley Ranch.
And who was your employer?
Mr. Jackson.
Michael Jackson?
Michael Jackson, yes.
The man seated to my right?
That is correct.
Mr. Salas, how long? Well, let me back up. When did you cease to work for Neverland Valley Ranch? When did you stop working there?
It was late June 2003.
And how many years did you work at Neverland Valley Ranch?
20 years.
Did you work there before Mr. Jackson bought that property?
Yes, sir.
And what did you do during your years at working at Neverland Ranch? What were you employed doing?
I was outside on grounds maintenance supervisor.
You were a supervisor of grounds maintenance?
Right.
And what did that involve?
Keeping up the place, maintaining the place, and any activities that needed to be done on the grounds.
Did you have people working under you?
Yes.
And how many?
I believe it was about 15 people, something like that.
15?
Uh-huh.
Who did you report to during that period of time?
We had a ranch manager.
And at some point, did you change jobs?
Yes, I did.
When was that?
I would say it was in the middle of 2002.
And what job did you take up? What was your new job at that time?
I was assigned to be the house manager for Mr. Jackson.
Was that a promotion?
I would say yes.
Okay. More responsibility?
More responsibility.
And what did you do as the house manager?
Making sure that the house was. Making sure that everything that the house needed to be done. I was just to make sure that everything was there for Mr. Jackson and his guests.
And when you say, the house, what structure or structures do you mean with specificity, specifically?
It was the main house and guest units, theater. Anything involved with the facilities of Mr. Jackson.
How many people did you have working under you as house manager?
8 people.
And what were their various employments? What did they do?
Housemaids and cooks.
So who did you report to when you were house manager?
We also have a ranch manager. But I also report to Mr. Jackson.
Did you report directly to Mr. Jackson?
Yes, I did.
And whereabouts did you work? What was, in your day-to-day life as house manager, your employment as house manager? Tell me about. Give me an idea of what you would do in a given day.
Well, we did the various of things, you know. Making sure that the place was clean. Making sure that we had everything stocked, supplies. And making sure that the guest house was clean. Stuff like that. Just keeping up with the place.
Did you have an office or anything of that nature?
Yes. There's an office in the house.
And where is that located?
It's in the back of the house, as you first go into the back door on the left side.
When Mr. Jackson was on the property, how often would you have contact with him, as house manager?
Daily basis.
More than once a day, or, give me an idea, if you would.
Sometimes it was once. Sometimes it was more than that. It depends.
And if Mr. Jackson wanted something done, let's say he wanted flowers in a certain place at the house, who would take care of that?
It was that responsibility. It was some other people who was in charge of the flowers.
Okay. Who would he tell that he wanted the flowers in that particular place?
Mr. Jackson will tell anybody that he wanted to first.
Okay. As far as keeping the kitchen stocked, was that one of your jobs?
Yes.
What about alcohol on the ranch? Was that your job as well, to keep alcohol stocked?
I had to make sure that we had what he needed or anything that needed to be in the house.
Can you characterize for me what level of service Mr. Jackson expected at Neverland Ranch?
The best.
What were your daily hours like?
It was pretty long hours. 7 a.m. to 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning. 3 o'clock sometimes.
Was that a normal day for you to work such long hours?
It was not normal, but it was a requirement that we had it, to get things done.
And can you characterize for me the expectation that Mr. Jackson had concerning the level of service?
Objection. Vague. Calls for speculation.
When you say, expectation, could you specify it a little bit?
Just a moment.
Okay. He's asked you to clarify.
You said that the services for Mr. Jackson was first class?
Yes.
Yes?
Objection. Misstates the evidence.
I can't recall exactly what you said. What did you say about the level of service?
That he expected the best.
He expected the best. Okay. And if he didn't get the best, would he let you know that?
Yes.
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Overruled.
Was Mr. Jackson shy about telling somebody, an employee, that he was displeased about something?
Not necessarily. He would tell you the way. He will make you understand what he wanted.
Did he ever fire people?
Not that I'm aware of.
Was he ever responsible for firing someone?
No.
You don't know if he ever wanted someone fired?
Objection. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Was anybody fired during the period of time that you worked there?
Yes.
Tell me, was anybody fired when you worked as a house manager?
No, nobody.
While you worked at Neverland, were you ever asked to maintain any level of secrecy about what happened at Neverland?
Objection. Leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
There's a procedure that when you are hired at Neverland Valley Ranch you do sign some confidentiality forms.
And when you agree to that form, what are you agreeing to?
To respect the policy.
What is the policy?
Of not talking anything that you shouldn't talk about, Neverland.
Okay. Are you allowed to talk about anything that happens on Neverland off the Neverland property?
No, you're not.
Why did you leave your employment at Neverland?
The reason I left, it was many things involving that. And I became to the point that I say, it's time for me to move on. There was some things that I didn't like about how things were running there. So it was a lot of stress, and I say, okay, it's time for me to move on.
Whose decision was it to leave Neverland?
It was my decision.
When you were working at Neverland as the house manager, did you have occasion to go into Mr. Jackson's private quarters?
Yes, I did.
Did you have occasions where you went upstairs into the bedroom area?
Yes.
Was there any notification system that signaled Mr. Jackson when someone was coming into his room?
Yes.
Can you describe it for me?
It was a doorbell as you come through the hallway. You can tell when somebody was approaching to the door.
And what kind of sound did it make?
It's a bell.
Just a bell?
Uh-huh.
Now, as you entered Mr. Jackson's room, tell me about the first level.
He had a big TV upstairs. There was some couches.
Were there windows in that area?
Yes.
Did they have any window coverings?
Yes, they did.
Generally speaking, would Mr. Jackson keep those? Well, let me, first of all, strike that. Let me ask you, what type of window coverings are we talking about?
Shutters.
Shutters?
Uh-huh.
Were there any curtains?
No.
Typically would the shutters be open, closed, or something in between? You tell me.
They were closed.
They usually were closed?
That's correct.
Could people from outside see inside Mr. Jackson's room?
No.
Was it generally dark in there?
Pretty much.
Objection. Foundation. Move to strike.
Overruled.
If I may approach, Your Honor.
May I see what counsels?
Yes, certainly. All right. Mr. Salas, I show you People's Exhibit number 338. Can you identify that photograph for me, please?
Yes. That's Gavin, Starr, and the sister.
Okay.
Devellin.
Devellin?
Devellin.
Are those the Arvizo children?
That is correct.
I show you People's Exhibit number 3. Have you ever seen that individual?
I probably have. I don't remember.
Okay. Does he look at all like somebody you've ever seen at Neverland Ranch?
Yes.
He does?
Uh-huh.
But you don't know his name?
No, I don't remember his name.
I show you People's Exhibit number 17. Do you recognize that picture?
Yes, sir.
And who is that?
Dieter.
Dieter?
Uh-huh.
Was he a visitor at Neverland Ranch?
Yes, he was.
I show you People's Exhibit number 18. Can you identify that photograph?
That's Mr. Ronald.
Ronald?
Uh-huh.
This photograph is maybe not so good, but I'll show it to you anyway. People's Exhibit 19. Are you able to identify that individual?
Yes. Can't remember his name, sorry.
Okay. We'll talk about him. People's Exhibit number 20. Do you recognize him?
That's Frank Tyson.
Frank Tyson. People's Exhibit number 21. I show you that. Can you recognize that?
That is Aldo.
Aldo?
Uh-huh.
And then I have 3 exhibits which we haven't introduced yet. Exhibit 46. Do you recognize that photograph?
I do, but I don't remember his name.
People's Exhibit 45?
Yes, I do.
Do you recognize that?
Yes.
Do you remember his name?
No.
And People's Exhibit 47. Do you recognize that photograph?
Yes, I do. Don't remember his name.
All right, good enough. First of all, going back to 47, how do you recognize this picture? Where have you seen that face before?
At Neverland Valley Ranch.
And have you seen this person at Neverland Valley Ranch on? Give me an idea of how many times he's visited there.
They can't hear you, sir, in the back.
How many times has this individual visited at Neverland Valley Ranch, if you know?
I'm not quite sure how many times. But he was there quite a few times.
Quite a few times? Did this individual associate with Mr. Jackson while he was at Neverland Valley Ranch?
Yes, he did.
Showing you Exhibit 45, can you tell me how many times this individual was at Neverland?
About the same amount of times.
A number of times?
Yes.
Did he also associate with Mr. Jackson?
That is correct.
People's Exhibit 46, same question. Was he? How many times did he come to Neverland?
Same answer.
Many times?
Uh-huh.
Did he also associate with Mr. Jackson?
That's correct.
Thank you. Those last 3 photographs that I showed you, Mr. Salas, is there anything that these 3 individuals have in common?
Objection. Vague.
Sustained.
Can you tell me, do those 3 individuals have anything in common concerning the area where they live?
They.
Objection. Vague.
They live in Los Olivos.
Overruled.
Alright, so, let's go back to the Arvizo family. Or, I think I'll begin with a different photograph. Could I have the Elmo on, please, Your Honor? Alright, showing you People's Exhibit number 3. You previously identified that photograph as someone that you've seen at Neverland Valley Ranch. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Can you tell me approximately, if you have seen that individual at Neverland Valley Ranch on more than one occasion?
I believe I have, but I'm not quite sure how many times.
Okay. Can you tell me if that individual had any association with Michael Jackson while he was at Neverland Valley Ranch?
Objection. Foundation.
I can.
Overruled. You may answer.
I believe they did.
Alright. Showing you Exhibit number 20. I believe you've identified this as whom?
Frank Tyson.
And how long have you known Frank Tyson?
I know Frank Tyson for quite a few years already.
Can you give me an idea how old he was when you first met him?
Not quite sure how old he was, but he was pretty young.
Okay. Can you estimate?
He was probably about 18 years, or something like that.
18 years old?
Something like that.
When you first met him?
Right.
Do you know how old he is now?
I don't.
Okay. And where did you meet him?
At Neverland Valley Ranch.
And did he associate with Mr. Jackson while he was at Neverland Valley Ranch?
Yes, he did.
How often?
I would say pretty often.
Do you know what his relationship was with Mr. Jackson?
Just a friend, I believe.
Okay. Have you ever described him as Mr. Jackson's right-hand man?
Objection. Leading. Move to strike.
Overruled. You may answer.
At one point, yes, sir, he was.
When was he Mr. Jackson's right-hand man?
Don't remember exactly the year that he was, but I believe it was probably around 90. I want to say that. Not quite sure of the year, you know.
1990?
Somewhere around there.
So that would have been 15 years ago?
Something like that, I would say. Maybe less than that.
How old do you think he is now?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I honestly don't know.
How many years have you known him?
Well, I want to say it was about 15 years since the first time I met him.
Alright. Now, why did you characterize him as Mr. Jackson's right-hand man?
Because at one point he came to the ranch and he is the one that was giving orders as to what to do around the property.
When he was there in 2003, well, let me back up. Was Frank Tyson on the ranch in 2003?
Yes, he was.
And when he was there in 2003, did he also give orders as to what should go on at the ranch?
No.
Didn't he also give you some orders, Mr. Salas?
Objection. Leading.
That's impeachment.
Misstates the evidence. It's asked and answered.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes, he did. I mean, he did, but not the same orders as when he was the first time. This was more like for Mr. Jackson.
More like he was giving you orders for Mr. Jackson. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Move to strike. The prosecutor didn't let him finish his answer. And that's leading.
Actually, he's just repeating what the witness said. Would you phrase a new question, please?
Yes. Thank you. Why do you say that he was giving you orders for Mr. Jackson?
Because many times, if things that needed to be done, or anything that need, to Mr. Jackson to be notified, he would said, I will take care of that. So that's how I realized that he was also giving orders.
Did you ever see Mr. Jackson give Frank Tyson orders or?
No, I didn't.
And did Mr. Jackson spend time with Frank Tyson in 2003?
Yes.
Can you characterize how often they would spend time together when they were at the ranch?
I would say, I don't know, about once a day or something like that. All depends.
Once a day they would get together?
On occasions. Not always, okay?
I'm just asking you for what you saw.
Right.
Okay. So when you'd see them get together during the day, can you tell me, whereabouts would they meet on the ranch? Where would you see them?
Many times it was in his office. Many times it was in the video library. Not in the video library. The library at the house.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes in Mr. Jackson's room.
When you say, his office, do you mean Mr. Jackson's office?
Mr. Jackson's office, yes.
Can you tell me, how would you characterize their relationship, based upon what you saw, the years of seeing them together?
Objection. Asked and answered.
Overruled. You may answer. Do you want the question read back?
Yes. Go ahead and ask the question again, please.
My question is, how would you describe their relationship, based on all the years that you saw Mr. Tyson and Mr. Jackson associating with one another?
I would say that it was some friend relationship, bonded together.
How would you characterize it in terms of closeness?
What do you mean by that?
Well, were they close friends or distant friends? You know what I mean, I think.
No, I think at one point they were pretty close friends.
Did they still appear to be friends in 2003?
Not really.
Not really?
No.
Well, Mr. Tyson was a guest in 2003, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
And he was. Did Mr. Jackson allow guests on the ranch when he didn't want them there?
Objection. Leading question.
It's argumentative.
Okay. Do you know if Mr. Jackson allowed anybody on the ranch who he was not friends with?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
If Mr. Jackson did not want somebody on the ranch, would he keep them out?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Is there a security gate at Neverland Ranch?
Yes, there is.
And does someone have to get permission to get into Neverland Ranch?
Absolutely.
And if Mr. Jackson says, "Don't let this person in," will that person get into Neverland Ranch?
No.
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Overruled. The answer is no.
Now, during this time in 2003, was Mr. Jackson still meeting with Frank on about a daily basis?
Objection. Misstates the evidence. Move to strike. It's leading.
Assumes facts. All sustain the objection.
Okay. When Mr. Jackson and Mr. Tyson, well, let me back up. In early 2003, January, February, March 2003, where was Mr. Tyson living?
He was at the video library.
At Neverland Ranch?
Yes, sir.
He had his own bedroom there?
They had a bed upstairs, yes.
And during that period of time in 2003, would you see Mr. Jackson and Mr. Tyson together?
Objection. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Occasionally, yes.
You would see them together?
Yes.
Did Mr. Tyson have an office set up at Neverland Valley Ranch during that period of time?
Yes, he did.
Where was his office?
It was in the video library.
Was there anybody else who had an office in the same area?
Yes. That was Vinny.
Who?
Vinny.
Vinny?
Uh-huh.
Who is Vinny?
Vinny was a friend of Frank Tyson. Or I guess, I should say.
Where was Vinny living during that time?
He was living in the same area, same place.
I show you Grand Jury Exhibit, or, sorry, People's Exhibit number 19. Can you identify that photo?
Yes, that's Vinny.
Alright. Do you know what the office that Vinny and Frank had in the video library was being used for? Do you know what they were using that office for during that period of time?
No, I don't.
That was in the house, is that true?
That was at the video library.
Is that in the house?
That is outside the main house.
Okay. And where is it?
That is above Mr. Jackson's office, upstairs.
Okay. So is that connected in some way by any building to the main house?
Yes, they're all bonded together.
They're all part of the same structure?
Right.
And would Mr. Jackson go up into the video library during that period of time, in early 2003?
I would say occasional.
And why didn't you know what was going on up there? Why didn't you know what Frank and Vinny were doing up there if you were the house manager?
Objection. Calls for speculation. No foundation. Leading.
Overruled. You may answer.
It wasn't my business to find out what they were doing up there.
Were you ever discouraged from asking those kinds of questions?
Objection. Leading.
Sustained.
Not really.
Withdraw the objection. Laughter.
To the jury. You know, I think we're at a point where we'll stop, because we have to take up a motion with the attorneys before the end of the day. So I'll let you go early. We'll see you on Monday morning at 8:30. If you haven't seen the wildflower displays, I went out yesterday. It's really worth seeing. Highway 58 up by Lake Santa Margarita. If you go out on that, it's just carpets and carpets of yellow and spotted with blue, and it's just a nice way to relax. I recommend it. Thanks. I'll see you. Remember, next Wednesday we're dark.
Mr. Salas? You come this way.
Oh, somebody needs to guide me.
All right, Mr. Sanger, you had a motion you wanted to make?
Yes, Your Honor. There's actually two things. But the first is a motion regarding prosecutorial misconduct, and the issue is the admonishment by the prosecutors to their witnesses to conform to the court's orders. In particular, in this case, we have several witnesses, Louise Palanker, who discussed her testimony with Jamie Masada, and perhaps vice versa, but at least there's clear evidence of that. We have Bill Dickerman, who talked with Dr. Katz. We had Larry Feldman, who talked with Mr. Dickerman and Dr. Katz. And it is up to the parties who call the witnesses to admonish them to conform to the court's orders. The courts already admonished the prosecution that they need to do that with regard to the gag order and going outside and talking to the press. That may have occurred, actually, since the court made that admonishment. But in particular, at this point, I'm addressing the discussion of testimony between witnesses who are witnesses called by the prosecution. The prosecutor has sufficient staff, including a witness coordinator, to take care of this, sheriff's personnel and the DAs themselves. It seems to be a consistent problem, and as a result of that, I believe it rises to the level of prosecutorial misconduct. It could be conveniently forgotten, but it just couldn't be innocently forgotten after all this time, and the repetition of the misconduct on the part of the witnesses that we've heard. So I'd ask the court to fashion an appropriate remedy. Remedy number 1, of course, in any misconduct situation, prosecutorial misconduct situation, is a mistrial. And depending on how the court rules on that, I have a proposed curative instruction. But the court would have to rule on the first remedy before we get to that, I believe. I can go ahead and give the court a quick idea, because I don't want to spend unnecessary time. If the court denied the motion for mistrial, I think a proper curative instruction is along the lines of other instructions, that the court can advise the jury that witnesses called by a particular party, in this case the prosecution, are supposed to be admonished by the lawyers calling them to conform to the court's order. And if the jury finds that they have not conformed to the court's orders, particularly in this case, not to discuss their testimony with other witnesses, that the jury can draw an adverse inference from that as to the credibility of the witnesses, and as to the strength of their testimony. And that the jury, if they find that to be true, can disregard the entire testimony of the witness, unless the review of all the facts in the case supports the testimony of that witness. And that would be the alternative, but I propose that only in the event that the court denied the motion for mistrial.
Counsel?
Well, first of all, Your Honor, I don't think there's any evidence that they were discussing their trial testimony. The discussion was they had conversations. There's no evidence at all that I can hear of that they talked about their trial testimony. And even in the case of Palanker, she didn't discuss her trial testimony. She discussed some observations about the behavior of one of the lawyers in the courtroom. And
when did she do that?
I'm sorry?
When did she do that?
When Mr. Masada testified, when counsel asked Mr. Masada, he was trying to get him to say that she said something about the pathological liar thing, but she really didn't. She really said something else. She said, I don't want to describe it again, but I can if you want me to, about counsel's behavior, that he was.
Did she say that outside the courtroom?
Yes, sir. It wasn't.
I haven't watched this.
No. Let me go back.
I'm missing something.
The whole thing. These ought to be put in writing, if there's a motion, and we ought to be able to respond in writing. It would be more efficient.
Let's do this. I think that's a good way to do it. Why don't you put something in writing for Monday morning, and
My free time on the weekend while I'm looking at the flowers?
yes, if you want, if you look at the flowers, I'll give you till Tuesday. Laughter.
There's an incentive. I'll do both and try to get it for you on Monday, Your Honor.
And then you'll have to respond by Tuesday.
Okay. The other matter.
Okay.
It was simply that we had submitted, I believe, by remote control proposed instructions on the 1108 and 1101, and I believe the court got it, although I was sitting here.
Yes, I did. I received it.
And I believe the prosecution indicated they were relying on the straight CALJICs.
They showed me theirs. They pulled. Did you show each other what you had given me?
They served it.
I gave the clerk the copies of the ones that we had given you, but they already had a copy of those previous. They're the standard 1108, 1101 instructions.
The only reason I asked that is there's a little more. You gave a couple of, there's more than just the key instruction. There's some others that may or may not be given. It gave a package. And I'm not saying it's outside of the framework. It's just, there's a couple more. I just want to be sure everyone's looking at the same instructions.
I do not know which instructions they selected out. And we did serve ours, I believe, on the prosecution. I'm sure we did.
Okay. Well, they can tell you the numbers. They are CALJIC instructions. Standard 1101, 1108. And that there were a couple of additional ones that are connected to it. I'm not saying they're not connected.
The burden of proof, yes, sir.
The burden of proof.
CALJIC says you have to give that when you give that instruction, yes, sir.
And I think there was one other, too.
Well, the standard of proof upon. I'll take care of it, Your Honor. There's no use wasting the court's time with that.
What I thought we would do. I won't give any instructions until we've all had a chance to discuss which ones should be given.
My understanding is the prosecution is going to call their first 1108 witness on Monday. Obviously this witness will still be going. So hopefully we'll have a chance to take that up at the 9:45 break, or something.
We'll take it up before we call 1108 witnesses, so that.
Very well.
Because I want to do that.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, we'll see you on Monday.